Before the end of the lecture, as I was thinking to be at the beginning, so I try to stop at around 10:15, as I have a Skype with my university that I cannot avoid. And what I want to try to explain and to show today is another part of my researches, which is somehow implied, if you want, by the last one that we have discussed about on Friday, because it's somehow a consequence of these studies of research about human-animal relationships, and it comes from a long interest that I have been cultivating during the last 6 years around human-animal studies. Human-animal studies has been, in the last decade, we can say, one of the more interesting new areas of the anthropological reflections. You know that the question of relationship between nature and culture is a sort of enormous element and theme of anthropological studies, evidently. And in the last decade, some colleagues, above all in the United States, but not only, even, for example, in Anglo-Saxon world, essentially, academic world, have discussed and cultivated this particular debate about the relationship between humans and animals. And what I'm trying to do is to apply this kind of research to my studies on cultural heritage, and particularly, I'm a horse person. I mean, people that I've been working all life long with horses somehow, privately, and I have always some contact, and I use also this part of my experience somehow for having this approach to a particular area of research, which is a human-animal relationship. You know that I've been studying in the last 5 years at least ceremonials and rituals that we have been discussed on Friday, a very controversial one on feasts involving animals and ceremonials involving animals, and all the polemics, all the contrasts, all the fights that animal rights movement had with this kind of practices, starting from the corridas, but jousts and pali and races, even the sport activities and leisure, how we are going to use animals and for which kind of reasons, and which kind of relationship we have with animals, and domesticated animals and savage animals and so on. This is, if you want, as I said before, a big theme for anthropology. You know that it has been the pivot of the reflection of anthropologists like Levi-Strauss or Edmund Leach, for example, even Evans Pritchard, working on newer monography around the population of the Nuer in Sudan, has given a lot of importance and attention to relationship of the tribes with cattle, with domesticated animals, and which kind of ideas about purity and impurity, regulation, rules about animals, and other. And also an important question, which is what is it has been somehow worked about by philosophers in the last 2-3 decades. I speak about, for example, Jacques Derrida or Agamben, or even Donna Haraway, that we have already spoken about, that work a lot on what the animal say to us as a category. I mean, as a sense, as a significance. What the animal opened for the mind of the man. What kind of idea we define very, very often ourselves in relationship to an animal opposite in nature and culture, and even the partage between nature and culture is often based on a difference between animals and humans. So it is a very huge and pivotal question somehow that many people have been treated in the last years. I'm in contact with a huge quantity of several colleagues and reviews that, above all on the United States, as I said before, but also, for example, in the University of Sussex in UK, are working on human-animal relationships. What I propose is a study, is not a study, this is a synthesis of the study I'm actually doing on this topic about the idea of horse heritage. This is extremely important because, as we said and as we saw in the Friday lesson, ceremonials and practices with animals, above all horses, but also cows, are becoming and are already an heritage. I mean, they are rituals and ceremonials that have been even candidated to UNESCO ICH list and so on. But more complexively, horse and horse culture and animal cultures are an heritage. And I try to approach this question like this. So an approach to horsemanship and horse culture like a form of a system of knowledge practice. So we look to horse heritage in the frame of heritagization discourses and narratives, horse riding and caring of the horses as a multi-sided community of practice. This is a very global one. People that come all over the world and is in touch because they are horse persons. They are people that work with animals and particularly with horses, not only in professional sport activities, but for example people that go only for tourism by horse riding, people that move trying to have amusements and occasion and events linked to the horse activities, and a globalized and transnational representations of this practice all over the world. Working on horses and heritage involves many elements. Evidently, as I said before, a relation between human and environment, evidently, and the human-animal relations and bonding, the way that animals, and particularly human and horses, bond themselves and have this particular link. Animal rights activist discourses, which are extremely important on this. Think about the fact that, for example, in the extreme line of engagement, animal rights movements say that it's not possible to ride a horse because it is a colonial act. It is not only a domestication act, but it is a violent act to ride a horse. That horse have to be free and without a saddle and to walk around, and eventually you can have a walk with him, but in parallel, you by feet and he with his legs, but it cannot absolutely be mounted because the mount to be at a horse back is an act of domination. It is extremely interesting because it implies, if you want, a series of metaphors even that are finally true. Think about the fact that the idea of domestication of horses has been, for example, used for alluding to the domestication of women. And in effect, many people that work on animal rights movement and animal rights debate actually are women, anthropologists and philosophers that are engaged in movement or radical liberation for women. So it's extremely interesting because it's sort of a rework, of re-debate, of rethinking of the limits between I cannot say anthropocentric, phallocentric, all those discourses that have been treated in the last 2 or 3 decades about even woman, male-female relationships. Local cultural traditions is evident what I said before, which are revitalized, reinvented and invented sometimes. and elitarian tourism. This is a very important and huge question because tourism, horse riding tourism, is often intended and conceptualized as an elitist tourism. So it's interesting to study also as a matter of anthropology of tourism, somehow as a sort of characterization for belonging to a class or a level, a social level, to do this particular kind of tourism around the world. And an extremely successful business shrine is a sector very lucky sector actually for breeding, evidently, because the production of the races, for example, for sport and leisure horses, is in a huge market. There is a colleague in UK who is engaged on research with breeders, with horse breeders in England. And she has written a beautiful monograph dedicated to producing the race. So she has studied all the interests and also the relationships between families that traditionally breed horses in England, and all their links, for example, to the crown and to the queen and to the monarchy of UK, and the link to a way of spending free time in England. So a sort of definition by this activity and the production of the race. What I mean with the production of the race, for having horses feed for particular activities, like, for example, gallop competition, or trot competition, or equitourism, or walk and therapy. You know that many horses have been are used for therapy with people with disease. We need to have particular development of races, of breeding line, and there is a huge market on this, and also a network of people and families, and also a network of people that buy this kind of animals. So a very interesting market trends. Sports, evidently, tourism, high quality artisanal accessory. We are going to see something. Horse riding is represented and narrated in many different contemporary contexts. For example, a very globalized and ancient practice. This is true. You know that, for example, you are one of the first ground in which European horses have been domesticated. The horse Przewalski was in this area and a bit more toward the eastern territories, and it has been probably the first domesticated horse in Europe. And actually there are some programs in Eastern Europe for recuperating this particular kind of small horse, which was extremely resistant, also because of the climate, evidently, for the weather, for snow and cold and so on, and who is typical of these territories. And we are going to see how much typicality of a race and the link to the territory has been somehow one of the way of building the sense of the region, of a nation even, in some cases. A very embedded practice, because every place and every region has its particular tradition of domestication, dressage, and so on. And inhabiting and traveling along spaces slowly enough for knowing and appreciating them. This is a very important point for anthropology of tourism, evidently, because is engaging experiential tourism and all the things about slow move that you know certainly that it is one of the main line of development for tourism today, and a break with the stressful rhythms, evidently, of urban ways of life. So this is interesting because also imply a particular relationship with between countryside and urban and the city. At the same time, this shift in the horse word representation implies other things like crossing bloodlines in order to improve and making horses, what I was saying before about the production of a race, fit to sport performances or easier to ride for amateur and tourists, in ambivalent relation between technologies of the nature. I'm very interested, as you probably argued, to the technologies of nature. They are extremely interesting, and they are not only a recent phenomenon, because the bloodline crossing is an ancient practice of people that exchange, for example, type of horses and other type of dogs and other for producing the race fit for particular actions linked to human behaviors, linked to human traditions. For example, think about all the dogs involved in breeding activities that are the result of a huge activity of crossing bloodlines by the herders, that produce finally particular races, because there are many kinds, but particular races of dogs that are fit for the breeding activities and sharper and more able to understand what they have to do with the cattle for controlling them. And social-cultural practices, evidently, the valorization of horse breeding and of many other local practices and artisans like farriers. Think about the huge quantity of artisanal and handcraft and all the types of artisanal knowledge that are implied by the horse heritage, like farriers, saddlers, traditional horse trainers, domesticators, but also all the people that is involved, for example, in cleaning stables, in starting the activities with babies, and so on. So there are a huge quantity of professionality. And the shifting of horse riding in a form of leisure, useful to understand contemporary urban-rural relations. So I tried here, but it's not it's not a completed project evidently, to realize a multi-sided ethnography of a horse heritage involving several case studies, particularly in France, the Haras nationaux et les quatre noirs de Saumur. I've been in Saumur just at the beginning of February, and I had many exchanges with them, which are one of the most interesting examples of heritageization. French people are the professional heritageizators, you know, and they like to heritageizate everything, and in fact, in 2011, les Haras nationaux et l'École nationale d'éducation de Saumur has obtained the recognition like a intangible cultural heritage issue as the culture, the equestrian culture in Europe. Another point is horse heritage in the US, particularly all the schools that are interested on natural horsemanship. You know that there is a huge culture in the US because of the things that I was saying before, interested on natural horsemanship. I don't know, Buchanan, all these people that maybe you have seen an ancient movie around the man who was whispering to the horses, which is a novel, very famous novel, American novel, centered around this particular relation of domestication of horses. It is a real story of Buchanan, who is, I think he's still alive, who was an important horseman in US that started this school of natural horsemanship, in which, for example, all the activity of domestication are not linked to violent gestures, and all the things are obtained by the horse naturally. And you think this is, it could be seem something very curious to work on this, but think about that. In the ancient Greek times, one of the first and the basis for becoming a real citizen for soldiers and men of the Athens city was to read the treatment or the book of Xenophon, dedicated to the domestication of horses. They consider this a sort of philosophical reflection on what a man was. And Xenophon said that a man in the sense, evidently for ancient Greek, was a male man, a man in the sense of a man, and not a human mankind, a man who was able to obtain a result from the other living beings, like animals, but also like women, without constraints. So the people who was really men were able to obtain results from people without violence. It's interesting because it was a sort of image of a real man, and it was linked to an image of natural domestication. Slovenia, where there is a huge, very important center of horse valorization in Lipica. Arab horses, but here simply is an observation through the web until this moment. It is a huge culture because in Arab culture horses are at the very center of a series of metaphors even for the culture. For example, the concept of furuzia, which is natural horsemanship in Arab thinking, is exactly the same of the American one. And you know that since many years the president, the honorary president of the International Federation for Equestrian Activities, so the World Federation for the Equestrian Activities, the FEI, F-E-I, is managed by the Princess of Jordania, and she has insisted a lot on this element of furuzia, like the principle to which all the activities around horses has to be centered. And finally, my herd, my region in Italy, on Tuscany Maremma, where there is a huge construction of the locality through the breeding of free horses. So Maremma, in the imaginary of European people and Italy above all, is the place where there are free horses. A little bit, maybe you have heard about it, as in Camargue in France. I started with the French case because finally I was there and I worked with this and many years ago. And in France, the case of valorization and heritagization of horse culture has been extremely important. Starting in 2000-2001, systematically, I mean, even before was active a sort of interest on valorization of horse cultures, but from the 2000, this has been really systematic activity, so museums, cultural activities, visits, touring, festivals and conferences. Here you see only some of the reviews of the quantity of publications and the Salon de Cheval, etc., which have been organized around the theme. And a very important thing, this has been the occasion and the line through which a lot of buildings have been restored. I mean, the idea of cheval patrimoine, as they call horse heritage, has become the occasion for restoring and recuperating a lot of territories, a lot of castles and structures. Le haras nationaux are the national saddles, which have been completely restored through this idea that is not only an architectural heritage, but also a cultural heritage, a practice heritage, you know. So many congresses have been organized and cultural events on the topic of French national stats. So they have restored, as I saw French written, I start to speak French. As you see in the main left of your of this image, les écuries des châteaux français are really, I'm going to be mad, are an edition dedicated to the restore, complete restore. Look at how beautiful they are, of this building, which are historically the site where in the past times the halls of the crown were settled, and this is, on the contrary, the center of Saumur, of Les Quatre Noirs. Les Quatre Noirs is the national school for equitation, which was at the beginning a military school, but actually is the national sport school, you know, for preparing the people that are going to do national level sport, equestrian activity and sport. And all the trainers, national recognized trainers, is a sort of certification school for trainers on horse activities. To realize an efficient valorization of horse heritage, and many scholars and experts were involved in this cultural operation. We have historians, sociologists, geographers, anthropologists, scientists, and think about this. In Saumur, where the Quatre Noirs is settled, where there are the national stars, there is, as here Szczecin in relationship to Katowice, there is a detached site of the University of Angers, which is very, very close to Saumur, which is only centered on first cycle, second cycle, on tourism and cultural heritage, and where the focus is around horse heritage exploitation and generally sport and leisure exploitation. It is extremely interesting because they see that this is, I was speaking with the director of the national school in Saumur, National Equestrian School, and he said, we are strongly convinced that this is our vocation, our territorial and regional vocation, which is extremely interesting, if you want. They have, they admit that horse heritage is somehow their center for the representation of this area. And evidently, is not only matter of restoration of building, is also a sort of symbolic network of activities. At the center of this image, you see, for example, one of the beautiful foulards of Hermès, which are traditionally centered around the equestrian activities and generally fox hunting, horse riding, fox hunting activities. A lot of things about fashion, centered around horse style, even horse style dresses, because you can dress horse style dresses even if you don't go horse riding. So it is extremely interesting because you see here a sort of more complex niche of activities. I don't know why. What I have to do?
The clock. Press the clock.
The clock.
Yes.
Okay. And these are all activities that have been considered, been solicited by this activity of recuperation, which is the recuperation of buildings, evidently, of the areas, of the visits to the Quatre Noirs, but also to the developing of all these fashion activities and tourist activities and so on. And at the same time, evidently, French are very able to build archives even, and French people, and they have constructed a lot and financed a lot of interesting archives on this. Think about that in Saumur there is maybe one together with the library of Kentucky University, which is one of the most specialized on this theme, maybe the best one library dedicated to sport activities and particularly to horse knowledge. And at the same time, French National started becoming the center for a lot of book, and even all the archives are being digitalized, and also the activities of restoring of the buildings. So an enormous horse research, even on the network, on the internet, because we have a lot of, for example, repositories for breeders of horses and for declaring the level of their stud or the level of their animals and so on. And performances. This is important because it's not only a matter of archives and historical research, as we are speaking about something that is heritage-ized, even in the sense of the commodification somehow of culture, it becomes a huge event. Right? The Quatre Noirs, here you see some of the shows that they systematically organize all over the world, is becoming one of the most important horse shows in the world, but it's not only the one. I could, if I had the time, I could show to you, for example, people that make theater systematically with horses, like, for example, Bartaba in French, who is I can say a gypsy theater author, who is working during 3 decades already with the gypsy people, and he organized very visionary shows all over the world using horses during the performances, and many other. For example, the Théâtre du Centaure is another company which is interested and centered around, and not only in France. I met, for example, theatrical group that work with the horses and disability in the performances in England, in USA, even in Italy there are someone. So it's very interesting and so much spectacularized somehow, and it's interesting because after the nomination, the UNESCO nomination, it is not so systematic, because UNESCO is not, I can say, a prize. It's not a recognition in terms of, so you are okay, let's exploit your cultural heritage, but nonetheless, after the nomination to the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage list, the Quatre Noirs started an enormous campaign of promotion, of visibility and spectacularization, like you see, and it is an excellent example of heritagization of the horse world and an equestrian community of practice. And finally, market. This is another very important element. Cultural heritage and the processes of heritagization are strictly linked to question of commodification of the cultural issues. Good or evil that they are, because we have to reflect about what does it mean to commodificate, to transform a cultural issue in a commodity. It's a very, very critical passage, and we have a lot to reflect about. But anyway, and nonetheless, here you can see how much in the last years, so you see, for example, images from 2010, 2012, 2013, but now is possibly even more than actually. When I was in Saumur on February, they were organized, for example, an international salon with Austrian national staats and Alta Escuela in Vienna, the high school for equestrian cultures in Vienna, and evidently in Sevilla, in Spain. And they were organizing all this because they are thinking to a sort of enormous European fair for horses, for horse market. So, and this was, it's not a case. The Randonnée du Patrimoine and the other things are linked to the moment in which, in 2014, French was hosting the World Championship of Equestrian Sports. So you see even the enormous network of financial interests that are moved around cultural heritage. So you build a sense to cultural heritage for sport and leisure activities with horses, and then the market follows. So it's interesting because we have to look to this without, how can I say, I'm not nostalgic, I'm looking to phenomena. I'm trying to understand what is happening in society and what is managed through culture. And this is very excellent examples of a use of culture, typical culture of a country for enhancing a market. So it's extremely interesting for us, but also maintaining some very strong element of culture. For example, look here, during the World Champions, all the French regions that are historically interested by the production of particular line of horses have organized fairs and cultural occasion and sport leisure activities and so on. And at the same time, you find Randonnée du Patrimoine, so meeting for the heritage, avec bénédiction des chevaux, with the blessing of horses. So you have this very, very controversial and ambivalent mixage of elements of culture, of tradition, even of religious significance, and at the same time a huge interest on the market. So let's see something about home. About home, because finally we find some element in a very analogous way to France. This is my hearth, this is my home. Not exactly here, but perhaps around. And these are the three horses of Maremma. Maremma is a particular area of Tuscany in front of the sea, which has a great laguna, and mare. How can I say laguna? Do you understand laguna? It's okay. And laguna where there is a reserve, an animal reserve, a natural reserve, where horses and bulls are free to grow, and this has become somehow a sort of icon of his territory. So what I was trying to study and to understand doing this research was how much horse culture was becoming, as for the Camargo, for example, the idea of the territory, the icon of a territory. So you see Grosseto, which is the headquarters of this region, organize every year a festival of horses with an exposition and even a horse jumping and dressage championship. These are beautiful images of this natural reserve, where you can also see in place a lot of activity of implementation of the production. I mean, European funds for producing particular autochthonous races. You see, every time this very, very huge link between natural and cultural between biocultural heritage. And at the same time, a lot of revitalized practices. You know, because on the very left of the image, you see these two men, so both here and here in the present, which are the butteri of Maremma. The butteri are and were the traditional domesticators of horses. They still keep continuing to domesticate horses according to the ancient practices, but evidently we don't need no more to catch the small cows like before. So they actually are organized in small companies of butteri that do spectacles and shows of traditional domestication all over the countryside in Tuscany, in a big residence and villas where people are organizing, I don't know, marriages or events, and they arrive like a company of show. I mean, there are a show already, and they show this kind of ancient practices. These are butteri at the beginning, in the origins, at the beginning of the 20th century. In the same, you see, this is the Laguna, anyway, and it's interesting because they are evidently dressed the same way and so on, but I say they only do rehearsal, sort of representations. And a huge thing to couple with this is interesting because this is falconry witnessing, and you know that falconry has been submitted and obtained the recognition as international cultural heritage to the UNESCO Cultural Heritage List in 2013 in a very big international network to which even Czech, as I showed in the first lectures that we have together, falconry is, for example, also for Czech and Slovakia. They have submitted with Italy and Germany and Morocco and other countries the candidature of falconry traditional practices, which was strictly linked to butteri activities because they were going in the countryside, domesticating cows and horses and small horses, and using falconry for hunting. I actually don't start with a particular area of my interest because evidently falconry has been admitted to the UNESCO ICH list, but there were a lot of controversial polemics by the animal rights movement because you know maybe that for domesticated falcons they need a sort of violence and pressures on the animals. The animals have been covered, they cannot see for a long time. In the ancient time they were blind, made blind I mean, by the owners. So it has been not a friendly activity for animals, but nonetheless this huge network, international network, has obtained the reconnaissance. You see, what I was saying before, horse heritage implies also an important revival of artisanal practice, in which history, identity, the sense of place, the belonging to places and conspicuous consumes are today mixed together. Why I say the conspicuous consumes? Conspicuous consumes is a very specific notion of Toiblen, which was a sociologist of the beginning of the 20th century, which was isolating the idea of the consumes as a sort of representations of the richness of the social position, and that after has been exploited by, for example, Bourdieu's studies on the distinction, economic distinction, and the distinction of taste. So why I use this idea of conspicuous? Because around the horse heritage, a very high placed class, a very upper class level of taste has been centered. It is a very material practice, it's a very concrete practice, but which has been used and exploited for placing people in a huge upper level position. At the very center of this image, you see, for example, all these are the traditional practice, so saddlery, traditional saddlery, and farriers, and people who work on the hoof of the horses, very interesting also in terms of ritual, you know, blacksmith, and the activity of farriers are a huge part of the ancient society. Think about that farriers in the ancient society were considered somehow the magician, because they managed the fire and the metals for first. But around all this, you see at the very center of this image the use of traditional knowledge of saddlery for producing a very upper level object, like saddles for equitation, professional equitation, and for example bags and boots that are extremely expensive. So you have a sort of reconversion of a traditional sector in a very upper class sector. And it is very interesting because tradition is becoming a sort of resource for a completely different market. And evidently, this become possibly even more important in an enormous context like US heritagization of horses. In US, horse heritagization has been realized in many different ways. You see, before we saw in 2014 the World Championship, which is every 3 years, happened in France, and in 2011 was in Kentucky, US, in Lexington, and has been defined during this period, the horse has been defined the horse capital of the world. It's interesting, the idea of Kentucky is a state, is impressioning. I've been there for 2 times, and I visit this enormous and very, very interesting museum that they have realized that during the preparing the World Heritage Championship in USA, and also a part of the university classrooms are dedicated to these topics, even like in Saumur. But it is interesting because you see saddle by saddle. You see an enormous territory which has been completely shaped by horse production activities. And in many northern states we can find everywhere the idea of wild horses. Let's think how much in the, I cannot say, the imagery of the American frontiers, the question of free horses and native, for example, the association between natives and free horses. Maybe you have in mind this very global movie which is Spirit, the Cimarron horse, an animation movie very liked by babies. But it is interesting because finally exactly this association between native culture and horse culture, and this idea that the very nature of United States, of the frontiers, of the freedom of United States is centered around this idea of the Mustangs, free in the prairie, free in the plain of US countryside. And you see here Black Hills Wild Horses Sanctuary. In America we have I'm not American, but there are many horse sanctuaries, and it is interesting also. Let's have a bit a digression on this, because you know, the idea of animal sanctuary is something that is good to think. People is very, very happy to think about a place where animals can be conserved and saved and recovered and so on. But it has becoming even some place a way for preserving territories for tomorrow. I explain how. This particular sanctuary, for example, on Black Hills Wild Horse Sanctuary, is owned by an NGO, so a non-governative organization. But many, many sanctuaries have been organized and financed by private foundations that take off the territories for very few money to the small private owners. And I'm going to say to you something that will be surprising for you. They take these territories for small owners, having some incentive for doing this, for constructing, for building not only horse sanctuaries, but generally animal sanctuaries. And you know, finally, they obtained this result, and they preserve these territories as a foundation for preserving animals inside. But many of these sanctuaries, private sanctuaries, are owned and bought by foundations that are, how can I say, the extension of olive oil companies. One of them is the olive oil, not olive oil, petroleum companies. One of these companies is the Trump company. And the president of the foundation that was president of a sanctuary like this was his wife. So, you know, honorary president of the foundation of a big petrol company who owned a territory like this for preparing an animal sanctuary, in particular a horse sanctuary. Many activists, even animal rights movement activists, have demonstrated that they do this, they buy these territories, they very few money from the private owners, and they receive incentives for having sanctuaries, for realizing sanctuaries of animals, because they are territories, these are territories that actually are so much expensive for petrol exploitation, because petrol is too much deep in the territory for being exploited actually in an economic way. So what they are doing, they are taking this territory, preserving them through an activity, a benefit, a charity, finally, because this is a charity, on behalf of the welfare of animals and so on, but in effect they are preserving territories for the moment in which it will be possible to exploit this territory with few money than now. It's a bit complicated, but it's extremely interesting, because you see here in action a rhetoric of welfare of animal used for a very huge economically interest, you know. But at the same time, evidently, this is an enormous representation. I mean, Wild Horses and Heritage Days, Mustang Heritage Foundation, our land, our horses, you know, this idea, very strong idea of link about land and horses in the United States, preserving the American West, one wild horse at a time. So this idea of the very center of the imagery of America, of the whole America, centered around the horse image. And evidently, one of the most interesting narratives on horse heritage and human-animal relation is today represented by Parelli natural horsemanship, and before, as I said, Buchanan natural horsemanship. A sort of oxymoron in some way, horsemanship being a discipline, finally is a form of domestication, but represented as natural. Savage territories, new ruralism, These are all the implications on this. Animal rights activism, deep construction of national American identity is evident, but also horse business, evidently, media dissemination. You see that if you have a look to YouTube, you are going to find hundreds and hundreds of videos of natural horsemanship posted on YouTube and Facebook. Media dissemination, new relations between rural environment and urban ways of living. So here you see only some of the huge quantity of images and natural images and how can I say, suasive ideas and imagery of the natural horsemanship, which is finally a big affair, an enormous affair. Try to say something more general. Horse heritage as an institutionalized practice is also made by European policies and funding. This is very interesting because, for example, Council of Europe and European Community are systematically financing, for example, enhancing programs and breeding programs and so on. There are specific associations like ESSA, European State Stud Association. Even Poland make part of this State Stud Association, US Mustang Foundations and so on. A media dissemination. Think that, for example, there are media dedicated, not only in the US, for example in France. In Italy we have a normal cable TV on horse practices, every kind of animations, different state regimes of heritage of horsewood. For example, you have horsewood become an example of many different embedded communities of practice. How do you get horse? How do you do with horses? And which is your national tradition of horse practice? So the national rhetorics and transnational business. Think about, for example, you may have seen this very global movie which was War Horse of Spielberg, and it is a very global idea of horses that have been helping people during the World War. And it is a sort of representation because, you know, maybe if you have seen, you remember, as a very moving movie and so on, there is a moment in which the passage of the horsewood, for the protagonist, the animal protagonist of the movie, pass through the, how can I say, the Transi, the division between the French and German people, and they accept because this horse has been recognized by his previous owner, and the horse passed, and for a moment all is stopped. Like a sort of passage, a mediator between the opposite side. This is very Spielberg. I mean, if you think about all these movies. And equestrian cultures and horsemanship tradition increasingly become an element of promotion, evidently, as we said, as we saw before of different territories and culture. In this torsion of representation of horse and horsemanship as cultural heritage, we face, like I said before, and like many debates in USA are affording, a post-colonial approach to horses. People said, the debate, the anthropological and sociological debate said, we have been colonial, we have treated the material, the relationship with horses like on the colony, with an hegemonic anthropocentric behavior towards animals. This process of heritagization of horse cultures is a contemporary and unavoidable scenario in which relations between rural and the city has been rethought, and the elitarian and popular day practices are condensed in aesthetic representations of the nature by increasing place consumers. People that arrive and want to catch the spirit of a place, and horse cultures help to do it. I think about Maremma, USA, Kentucky, or I don't know, Camargue, France, like this, or Lipica in Slovenia, or by horse people, skilled cases, people that help to manage all these horse industries somehow, which are in effect people that have many particular and specific skills, which are traditional, finally, the skills of horse person. The control and management of the horse by man, then continued by other means, is a way of controlling horse images, focused on charm, nobility, prestige, evidently, and traditions, and horses become an heritage good to think object. Not to hit, not to abuse, evidently, in an apparently more horizontal and respectful attitude, nonetheless hierarchical somehow. We are anyway domesticating animals towards what is still imagined as the most beautiful conquest of man, which is one of the most important and most diffused quote about horses, which was of the captain of the American English army in 18th century. Thanks. So I hope it would be interesting for you, and if you have any question, I have anyway a very long, much longer version of this paper that I can leave here for consulting if you have.